It was a bitterly cold morning in late December, the kind where the frost clung stubbornly to the windows and the icy wind howled through the small town of Hillcrest. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a pale light over the snow-covered streets. Mary Johnson, a 76-year-old widow, stood at her kitchen window, watching the snowflakes swirl lazily in the wind. Hillcrest was the kind of town where winters were long, harsh, and unforgiving, but Mary had grown accustomed to the isolation the cold months brought. She lived alone in a small, weather-beaten house at the edge of town, where the roads were rarely plowed and the days stretched into long, quiet hours. It had been that way since her husband, Harold, passed away 5 years ago. They'd lived in that house together for over 40 years, raising their family and building a life that by all accounts had been full of love and laughter. But after Harold's passing, something in Mary's world had shifted. Her grandchildren, once the light of her life, had grown distant. The visits that used to be filled with joy and energy had become sporadic until they'd stopped altogether. Mary sighed as she poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising gently from the chipped porcelain cup she had owned for decades. Today was supposed to be different, though. Today, her grandchildren, Emily and Chris, had promised to come and visit her. They hadn't been to see her in nearly 6 months, and though Mary tried not to let it bother her, it gnawed at her heart. She had practically raised them when their parents had passed in a car accident many years ago. She was there for every scraped knee, every school play, every graduation, and yet now, they were strangers to her. Still, she was hopeful. Maybe they had been busy, caught up in their own lives. It was, after all, the holiday season, and she had convinced herself that they simply needed more time. Today, though, they were coming. They had promised to spend the afternoon with her, and she had spent the morning preparing. She made their favorite soup, an old family recipe passed down from her own grandmother, and even baked a batch of cookies that Emily used to love. She cleaned the house meticulously, despite her aching joints, and put out the nice tablecloth she saved for special occasions. As the hours ticked by and the snow began to fall more heavily, Mary grew restless. She glanced at the old grandfather clock that stood in the corner of the living room. They were supposed to arrive at noon, but it was now 12:30, and there was no sign of them. She tried not to worry, telling herself that the roads were probably bad. The weather had turned unexpectedly, and perhaps they were just running late. But as the minutes dragged on into hours, a knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. By 3 o'clock, the sun was already beginning to set, and the snowstorm had turned into a blizzard. The once peaceful snowfall now battered against her windows, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the old house. Mary's heart sank. She hadn't received any calls or messages from Emily or Chris. She tried calling their phones, but there was no answer. She left a voicemail, her voice trembling slightly as she asked if they were okay, hoping they were just delayed. With a heavy heart, Mary sat down in her favorite armchair by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The soup had grown cold on the stove, and the cookies remained untouched on the counter. She wondered if they had forgotten about her altogether. She didn't want to believe it, but a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe they didn't care as much as they once had. Just as she was about to resign herself to spending another evening alone, there was a loud knock at the door. Mary's heart leaped in her chest, and she hurried to answer it, her hope rekindled. Maybe they had just been delayed by the storm after all. But when she opened the door, her heart dropped. There stood Emily and Chris, bundled up in heavy coats and scarves, their faces barely visible in the biting wind. But instead of the warm, joyful reunion Mary had imagined, they stood there looking uncomfortable, almost guilty. "Grandma," Emily said, her voice cold and distant, "we need to talk." Mary's heart raced. "Of course, come in, she said, stepping aside to let them in from the cold. But neither of them moved. They just stood there, their eyes downcast, avoiding her gaze. "What is it?" Mary asked, her voice trembling slightly. Is something wrong? Chris shifted uncomfortably. We're not staying long, Grandma. We just wanted to tell you that we're leaving town. We're moving. Mary blinked in confusion. Moving? Where? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Emily sighed. We've been planning this for a while. We're leaving for the city tomorrow morning. We just wanted to stop by and let you know. Mary felt a sharp pang of hurt in her chest. But what about me? What about this house? What about? Chris cut her off. Grandma, you're going to have to figure that out. We can't take care of you anymore. We have our own lives to live. Mary stood there, stunned, the words not fully sinking in. But I thought you were coming to visit. I made your favorite soup. Emily shook her head. We don't have time for that, Grandma. We just came to say goodbye. Goodbye. The word hit Mary like a punch to the gut. They were abandoning her, leaving her in the middle of a blizzard with no explanation and no care for what would happen to her. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she swallowed them back, refusing to let them see her cry. Without another word, Emily and Chris turned and walked back to their car, leaving Mary standing in the doorway, the bitter wind whipping around her frail body. She watched as their car disappeared into the snowstorm, and with it, her last remaining family. For a moment, Mary stood frozen in shock. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How could they abandon her like this? After everything she had done for them, after all the love she had given, they were just leaving her behind without a second thought. As the cold began to seep into her bones, Mary slowly closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. The house, once filled with warmth and memories, now felt empty and cold. But as she stood there, shivering and heartbroken, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. She wasn't going to be a victim. She had survived worse in her life, and she wasn't about to give up now. Mary straightened her back and wiped the tears from her eyes. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let her grandchildren's betrayal break her. Not today. Not ever. And so, with a newfound resolve, Mary turned her attention back to the fire, its warmth spreading slowly through the room. The storm outside raged on, but inside, something had changed. Mary wasn't the fragile old woman her grandchildren thought she was. She was stronger than they could ever imagine. This was just the beginning. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Mary sat back in her chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, anger, heartbreak, all swirling together in a storm almost as fierce as the one raging outside her door. She had spent her entire life caring for her grandchildren after their parents had died, pouring every ounce of her love into them, believing that family would always be there. But now, in the span of a few minutes, they had walked out of her life as if she meant nothing. The words they had spoken echoed in her mind, haunting her. We can't take care of you anymore. We have our own lives to live. Mary couldn't fathom how it had come to this. They had always been so close, or at least she thought they had been. When did everything change? And why had she been left out in the cold, literally and figuratively? The sound of the wind howling outside grew louder, rattling the old wooden windows of her house. The blizzard was getting worse by the minute, and as much as Mary wanted to crawl into bed and forget about everything, she knew she couldn't stay here alone for much longer. The snow was piling up fast, and her house at the far edge of town wasn't well connected to anyone who could help her. With a heavy sigh, she grabbed her coat and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. She knew she needed to find some sort of shelter or assistance, but the thought of venturing out into the snowstorm made her shiver. Still, she didn't have much of a choice. If she stayed here, she risked being trapped and isolated, with no one to check on her. Her frail body wasn't built for such harsh conditions anymore. As she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a wall. The wind was brutal, biting at her cheeks and whipping her hair in all directions. The snow was already knee-deep, and visibility was nearly zero. She could barely make out the road in front of her house, let alone any possible landmarks. But she had to keep moving. There was a gas station a couple of miles down the road, and if she could just make it there, maybe she could call for help. Mary trudged through the snow, her feet sinking with each step. Every part of her body ached, but she pushed forward, driven by sheer willpower. She was used to fending for herself, but this was a different kind of challenge. This was survival. The bitter cold seeped into her bones, and her breath came out in short, visible puffs, but she refused to stop. Stopping meant giving up, and Mary wasn't one to give up. As she walked, memories of her grandchildren flooded her mind. She thought of the countless Christmas mornings when they had gathered around her tree, their faces lighting up with joy as they opened their presents. She had been the one to bake their birthday cakes, sew their Halloween costumes, and comfort them after every scraped knee or heartbreak. How had they turned so cold? Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes. But she kept walking, determined to make it to the gas station. The road was eerily quiet, the snow muffling every sound except for the howling wind. It was as if the world had been swallowed by the storm, leaving her completely alone in its wake. After what felt like hours, Mary finally spotted a faint glow in the distance, the gas station. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she drew closer, she noticed that the lights were flickering, and the building itself looked dark and abandoned. Panic began to creep in. What if the station was closed? What if there was no one there to help her? When she reached the door, her heart sank. The station was indeed abandoned, the windows boarded up, and the pumps covered in snow. It had been closed for a long time, but in her desperation, she hadn't realized it. The nearest help was miles away, and with the storm intensifying, there was no way she could make it there on foot. Mary stood in the snow, her body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. She was alone, miles from home, with no shelter and no way to call for help. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly helpless. The betrayal of her grandchildren, the harshness of the storm, the isolation, it all came crashing down on her at once, and she began to cry. But even in her despair, a tiny spark of defiance remained. She had been through too much in her life to let this be the end. There had to be something, somewhere she could go. She wiped her eyes with her gloved hands, pushing back the tears and the bitterness, and looked around. In the distance, just barely visible through the thick curtain of snow, she saw the outline of something, a small, dilapidated cabin tucked away in the woods. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed like her only chance. With renewed determination, Mary began making her way toward the cabin. It was farther away than it looked, and the journey was grueling. Her body was growing weaker with each step, and she could feel the frost creeping into her fingers and toes. But she kept moving, driven by the primal need to survive. By the time she reached the cabin, she was on the verge of collapse. The structure was old and run down, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of the snow. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were covered in frost. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all Mary needed. She pushed open the door and stumbled inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of decay. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for years, but it was dry and provided protection from the storm. Mary collapsed onto an old, tattered chair near the fireplace, her body shaking from the cold. She needed to warm up fast. Her eyes scanned the room, and she noticed a small stack of firewood by the hearth, along with a box of matches on the mantel. With trembling hands, she managed to light a fire. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around her like a blanket and easing the numbness in her limbs. For a moment, Mary simply sat there, staring into the flames, letting the heat seep into her bones. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was a strange sense of calm. As she regained her strength, Mary took stock of her surroundings. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished. Just a couple of old chairs, a table, and a bed covered in dust. There were no signs of recent activity, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the fact that it was abandoned. It was the way the furniture was arranged, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Her eyes fell on an old bookshelf in the corner of the room, its shelves filled with worn, yellowed books and faded photographs. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stood up, her legs still shaky, to take a closer look. She reached for one of the photographs, brushing off the dust with her fingers. It was a black and white image of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the very cabin she was now in. The picture looked old, maybe from the 1950s or 60s, but the faces were eerily familiar. A shiver ran down Mary's spine. She didn't recognize the people, but there was something unsettling about the photo. She placed it back on the shelf and picked up one of the old books. As she flipped through the brittle pages, she realized it was a journal, written by someone who had once lived in this cabin. The entries were faded and hard to read, but one passage caught her attention. "The storm is worse than we expected. We thought we could make it, but now, I fear we may never leave this place." Mary's heart raced as she read the words. Whoever had written this had been trapped here, just like she was now. She quickly flipped through more pages, searching for any clues about what had happened to them. The final entry was short and chilling. "We're not alone. Something is out there, watching us. I don't know how much longer we can last." A cold dread settled over Mary as she closed the journal. She glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the old wood. Was this place truly abandoned, or was there something, or someone, still out there, lurking in the shadows of the storm? The wind howled louder outside, and for the first time, Mary felt a twinge of fear. She wasn't sure what was waiting for her in the darkness, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in this cabin, and whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. Mary huddled closer to the fire, her mind racing. She had come here seeking shelter, but now it seemed like she had walked into something far more dangerous than the storm outside. And the worst part, she had no way of knowing what lay ahead. As Mary sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers, an uneasy feeling washed over her. The warmth that had initially comforted her was no longer enough to quell the rising sense of dread in her chest. The journal she had found, with its cryptic entries and unsettling warnings, played over and over in her mind. Something is out there, watching us. The words seemed to linger in the air, twisting around her like the cold wind that howled outside. The cabin, though small and worn down, had an eerie stillness to it. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed amplified in the silence. It wasn't just the storm that unsettled her. It was the sense that she wasn't truly alone. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit room, scanning the shadows that danced on the walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had been here before her, and that their presence still lingered. She stood up from the old chair, her legs still weak from the journey, and wandered back toward the bookshelf where she had found the journal. The photograph of the family still sat there, staring back at her from another time. The father's stoic face, the mother's gentle smile, the children, one boy and one girl, looked so innocent, so unaware of whatever fate had befallen them. Mary wondered what had driven them to this cabin, and what had ultimately happened to them. Her eyes fell on a thick, leather-bound book that sat on the shelf, its cover worn and cracked with age. She pulled it out and dusted it off, revealing a faded title, Hillcrest, A History. The book was heavier than it looked, its pages filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. It was a local history book, documenting the town's early days, but as Mary flipped through it, she realized it was more than that. It chronicled strange occurrences, disappearances, mysterious deaths, and inexplicable phenomena, all centered around this very area. One particular passage caught her attention. In the winter of 1953, the Carson family was reported missing after a heavy snowstorm. They had been staying in a cabin just outside Hillcrest, near the edge of the forest. Search parties were sent out, but no trace of the family was ever found. The cabin was left abandoned, and locals say it has been cursed ever since. Mary's heart skipped a beat. The Carson family. The same family in the photograph. This was their cabin. The very place where they had disappeared without a trace. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The journal's final entry had mentioned something watching them. Could it have been more than just paranoia? Was there something out in the woods, waiting for its next victim? The thought sent a surge of fear through her. She slammed the book shut and placed it back on the shelf, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't afford to let her mind run wild. The storm was bad enough. She didn't need to start imagining ghosts or monsters lurking in the dark. But as she stood there, alone in the quiet cabin, the sense of unease only grew stronger. As Mary sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers, an uneasy feeling washed over her. The warmth that had initially comforted her was no longer enough to quell the rising sense of dread in her chest. The journal she had found, with its cryptic entries and unsettling warnings, played over and over in her mind. Something is out there, watching us. The words seemed to linger in the air, twisting around her like the cold wind that howled outside. The cabin, though small and worn down, had an eerie stillness to it. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed amplified in the silence. It wasn't just the storm that unsettled her. It was the sense that she wasn't truly alone. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit room, scanning the shadows that danced on the walls. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had been here before her, and that their presence still lingered. She stood up from the old chair, her legs still weak from the journey, and wandered back toward the bookshelf where she had found the journal. The photograph of the family still sat there, staring back at her from another time. The father's stoic face, the mother's gentle smile, the children, one boy and one girl, looked so innocent, so unaware of whatever fate had befallen them. Mary wondered what had driven them to this cabin, and what had ultimately happened to them. Her eyes fell on a thick, leather-bound book that sat on the shelf, its cover worn and cracked with age. She pulled it out and dusted it off, revealing a faded title, Hillcrest, The History. The book was heavier than it looked, its pages filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. It was a local history book, documenting the town's early days, but as Mary flipped through it, she realized it was more than that. It chronicled strange occurrences, disappearances, mysterious deaths, and inexplicable phenomena, all centered around this very area. One particular passage caught her attention. In the winter of 1953, the Carson family was reported missing after a heavy snowstorm. They had been staying in a cabin just outside Hillcrest, near the edge of the forest. Search parties were sent out, but no trace of the family was ever found. The cabin was left abandoned, and locals say it has been cursed ever since. Mary's heart skipped a beat. The Carson family, the same family in the photograph. This was their cabin, the very place where they had disappeared without a trace. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The journal's final entry had mentioned something watching them. Could it have been more than just paranoia? Was there something out in the woods, waiting for its next victim? The thought sent a surge of fear through her. She slammed the book shut and placed it back on the shelf, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't afford to let her mind run wild. The storm was bad enough. She didn't need to start imagining ghosts or monsters lurking in the dark. But as she stood there, alone in the quiet cabin, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The fire crackled behind her, its light casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it was whispering through the cracks in the walls. Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She had to do something, anything, to distract herself from the growing sense of dread. She grabbed a few more pieces of firewood from the pile and fed them into the flames, watching as they caught and blazed up, filling the room with warmth and light. For a moment, she felt better, the heat soothing her aching body. But then, just as she was beginning to relax, a sharp sound broke through the silence, a loud thud from somewhere outside the cabin. Mary froze, her blood running cold. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The sound had been too deliberate, too forceful. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? A tree branch falling in the storm? Or was it something, or someone, outside, just beyond the cabin walls? She stood perfectly still, straining to hear anything else, but the only sound was the relentless howling of the wind. Slowly, she walked over to the window, careful not to make any noise, and peered outside. The snow was falling thick and fast, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. But as she squinted into the darkness, she thought she saw something, just a fleeting movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it her imagination, or was there really someone out there? She pressed her face closer to the glass, trying to get a better look, but the storm made it impossible to see clearly. For a long moment, she stood there, staring out into the swirling snow, waiting for something to happen. Then, another thud, this time, closer. It sounded like it came from the back of the cabin, near the old rickety door that led to the woods. Mary's pulse quickened. She wasn't imagining it. There was someone, or something, outside. Her first instinct was to lock the door, but when she reached for it, her hand hovered above the handle. What if it wasn't an intruder? What if someone needed help, just like she had? The storm was vicious, and if someone was out there, they wouldn't last long in these conditions. Despite her fear, a small part of her felt compelled to open the door and check. Gathering her courage, Mary slowly turned the rusted doorknob and pulled the door open, just a crack. The wind rushed in, cold and biting, but she pushed the door wider and stepped out onto the porch. Snow whipped around her face, stinging her skin, but she forced herself to look around. At first, there was nothing, just the endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of the trees. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it again, a flash of movement, a figure, hunched and shrouded in the snow, moving toward the cabin. Mary's breath caught in her throat. Whoever it was, they were coming straight for her. Her mind raced. She didn't know whether to call out or run back inside. The figure was still far enough away that she couldn't make out any details, but they were moving steadily toward her, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Something about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, set her on edge. This wasn't someone running for shelter. This was something else entirely. Fear surged through her, and without thinking, she slammed the door shut and bolted it. Her hands were shaking as she backed away from the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, clutching it tightly in her hands as she stared at the door, waiting. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. The only sound was the wind outside, howling louder and louder. Mary held her breath, her eyes glued to the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. No more thuds. No more movement. Just the endless storm. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, gripping the poker, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had imagined it all. The stress of the storm, the exhaustion, the fear, it could have all been playing tricks on her mind. Just as she began to lower the poker, there was a loud bang, this time, from the window. Mary spun around, her heart leaping into her throat once again. The window rattled violently in its frame, as if something had hit it from the outside. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the frosted glass, half expecting to see a face staring back at her. But there was nothing, just the swirling snow and the dark shapes of the trees. Suddenly, the fire behind her sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as the temperature in the room dropped instantly. She fumbled in the dark, trying to relight the fire, but her hands were shaking too much to hold the matches steady. Panic began to set in as she realized that whatever was outside, whatever had been making those noises, wasn't going away. And now, in the pitch-black cabin, with the storm raging outside, she was truly, utterly alone. Or was she? As the darkness closed in around her, Mary heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a low whisper coming from somewhere deep in the cabin. She wasn't alone. Something was in the cabin with her, and it was getting closer. Mary stood frozen in the center of the cabin, clutching the iron poker as if her life depended on it, which she realized with a sinking heart it just might. The whispering sound that had snaked its way through the oppressive darkness was faint but unmistakable. It sent a cold shiver down her spine, and her breath hitched in her throat as her heart pounded furiously in her chest. The fire had gone out completely, leaving the room bathed in shadows. The only light came from the faint glow of the snowstorm outside, filtering through the frost-covered windows. The silence that followed the whisper was unnerving, almost suffocating. Mary felt her legs begin to tremble, but she forced herself to stay still, every muscle in her body tensed like a coiled spring. Her eyes darted around the room, straining to see through the dark. She knew, deep down, that something was in the cabin with her, lurking just out of sight. The whispers had been too real, too close to be anything other than a presence. Whether it was human or something else, she wasn't sure, but the cold dread that filled her told her she was in danger. Mary's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to calm herself, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it be her grandchildren playing some sort of cruel joke on her? Could it be someone from the town? But the way the figure had moved outside, the way the whisper had slithered through the silence, it felt otherworldly, like something ancient and dark had been awoken. The rational part of her mind fought against the terror. She needed to get out, now, before whatever was in here revealed itself. She wasn't going to wait to find out what it was. Survival instinct kicked in, and Mary turned her focus to the back door. It was closer than the front, and if she could get out, she could make a run for the road. Maybe she could even make it back to the gas station, or find another cabin. Anything was better than staying here in the grip of whatever had invaded the space. With the poker still in her trembling hand, Mary moved cautiously toward the door, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She winced with every creak of the old floorboards, each sound magnified in the silence. She was halfway to the door when the whisper came again, louder this time, a rasping, breathy sound that seemed to come from all around her. "You're not alone. You can't escape." The words were like ice in her veins, chilling her to her core. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, as if something was lurking just out of sight, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Mary's grip tightened on the poker as she scanned the room. The whisper had sounded so close, right next to her, even, but she saw nothing. Only the dark, empty cabin, its worn furniture and decaying walls. But she knew, instinctively, that she wasn't alone. The back door was only a few feet away now. She could make it if she moved quickly, but her fear was paralyzing. She stood there, breathing heavily, her legs shaking, her mind screaming at her to move. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, she lunged for the door, yanking it open with all her strength. A gust of icy wind rushed in, whipping her hair around her face as the snowstorm raged outside. Mary stumbled out into the cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm had only grown worse, with snow coming down in thick sheets and the wind howling so loudly that it drowned out everything else. She turned back toward the cabin, expecting to see something or someone following her, but the door stood open, and the inside remained dark and silent. No figure emerged. No whisper called her back. For a brief moment, Mary wondered if she had imagined the whole thing, her fear playing tricks on her mind. But as she looked closer, she saw it. A dark, shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just barely visible through the swirling snow. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't come after her, but it stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Panic surged through her again, and Mary turned and ran. She had no clear direction in mind, just away from the cabin, away from whatever was lurking there. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a struggle, but she pushed on, driven by fear and desperation. Her breath came in short, painful bursts as the cold air stung her lungs. She couldn't see much beyond the blur of white snow and dark trees, but she knew she had to keep going. But her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, a branch snapping somewhere in the trees. Mary froze, her heart racing. The figure, it was following her. She whipped around, her eyes scanning the storm, but she couldn't see anything beyond the snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stood there, waiting, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, a deliberate crack of wood. Her mind raced. She couldn't outrun it, whatever it was. She had to face it. But how? She was an old woman, armed with nothing more than a fireplace poker, lost in a snowstorm. What chance did she have? But then, a strange sense of resolve washed over her. She had survived worse than this. She had lived through loss, through heartbreak, through loneliness. She wasn't about to let fear, or whatever this thing was, take her down. She had more fight in her than anyone gave her credit for, and if this was how it was going to end, she was going to go down swinging. With a deep breath, Mary raised the poker, holding it like a weapon, and took a step forward. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the storm. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she was ready to face it, ready to face whatever had been stalking her since she'd entered the cursed cabin. Then, out of the darkness, it appeared. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, hunched, its face obscured by the snow. It moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps crunching in the snow as it made its way toward her. Mary's grip tightened on the poker, her muscles tense, every fiber of her being on edge. But as the figure drew closer, she realized with a jolt of surprise. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't something supernatural. It was a man. He was dressed in ragged, snow-covered clothes, his face gaunt and pale from the cold. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting around as if he was seeing things that weren't really there. He looked wild, disoriented, as though he had been wandering in the storm for hours or days. Mary lowered the poker slightly, confused. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. He just kept walking toward her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes fixed on her with a kind of desperate intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse, barely audible over the wind. I thought I was the only one left." Mary stared at him, her heart still racing. "What are you talking about? Left where?" The man shook his head, his expression one of pure terror. "The cabin. It took my family. It's been waiting for someone else." A cold dread settled over Mary as the man's words sank in. The cabin. The Carson family. The disappearances. It all made sense now. The man stumbled forward, collapsing into the snow at her feet. "You have to leave," he gasped, his voice weak, "before it takes you, too." Mary's mind raced. The cabin. It had taken his family. And now it wanted her. But why? What was it about that place? The man's words were disjointed, his thoughts scrambled, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had happened to the Carson family, it was real, and it was still happening. She knelt beside the man, her fear momentarily forgotten. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice firm. "Can you walk?" The man shook his head weakly. "It's too late. For me." But Mary wasn't going to leave him behind. Not after everything. With a strength she didn't know she had, she helped him to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled through the snow together, away from the cabin, away from the darkness that had claimed so many lives before hers. As they trudged through the snowstorm, Mary realized something. The snowstorm, was unrelenting, but Mary pressed on, determined to get both herself and the mysterious man away from the cursed cabin. Every step was agonizing, her legs feeling like lead as they pushed through the thick snow. The cold was biting into her, and she could tell from the way the man leaned heavily against her that he was fading fast. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, each one more labored than the last. She had no idea where they were going, but anywhere was better than the cabin. The thought of it, dark, silent, and menacing, made her blood run cold. Whatever curse lingered there, it had claimed lives before, and she wasn't about to let it take hers. But the man's words haunted her, echoing in her mind. It's been waiting for someone else. It took my family. Who was this man? What had he seen? He had said the cabin had taken his family. Was that the Carson family from the old photograph? Had he been one of the children in the picture, now grown into a broken, half-mad shell of a man? Mary's mind raced as she tried to piece it all together. But the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. If the cabin was cursed, how had he survived all these years? And why had the curse remained dormant, only to awaken now? Her thoughts were interrupted as they finally reached the outskirts of Hillcrest. The dim lights of the town's houses flickered in the distance, blurred by the swirling snow. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that she still didn't know what kind of reception awaited her. Would anyone believe her story? Would they even help her? The betrayal of her grandchildren still stung, and though the small town was tight-knit, it didn't mean everyone would rally to her side. They stumbled into the nearest house, one she recognized as belonging to the Millers, an elderly couple who had lived in Hillcrest for decades. Mary banged on the door with what little strength she had left, praying someone would answer. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, revealing the bewildered faces of Ed and Marge Miller, both bundled in thick robes, clearly shocked to see anyone out in this weather. "Mary? Good Lord, what's happened to you?" Ed asked, his voice a mix of concern and confusion as he ushered them inside. Marge quickly threw a blanket over the shivering man and began helping Mary out of her snow-soaked coat. "You're freezing. Come by the fire, both of you." For a moment, Mary allowed herself to relax. The warmth of the fire brought back a semblance of life to her frozen limbs, but the urgency of the situation still gripped her. As Ed helped the man into a chair, Mary began to speak, her voice trembling from more than just the cold. "We need help," she started, her eyes darting between the Millers. "Something terrible has happened. There's a cabin out in the woods, near the old Carson property. I think it's cursed. This man, his family." Marge frowned, exchanging a glance with her husband. "Cursed? Mary, you've been through an awful lot. Maybe you're just tired." "No," Mary interrupted, shaking her head fiercely. "It's real. I know how it sounds, but you have to believe me. The Carson family, they disappeared years ago. And now, this man," she gestured to the stranger, who was now half-conscious by the fire. "He told me it's been waiting for someone to claim." Ed sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "The Carsons. I remember that. Happened when I was just a boy. People said all sorts of things back then, but we chalked it up to the storm. They must have gotten lost in the woods." "No," Mary insisted. "It's more than that. That cabin, it's alive. Or haunted. I don't know what it is, but there's something there. Something dark. I barely escaped." Marge placed a hand on Mary's shoulder, her expression soft but skeptical. "Let's get you both warmed up first. We can sort out what happened once you've had some rest." But Mary couldn't rest. Not now. Not when she knew what was at stake. "There's no time. We have to warn the others. If someone goes out there, they won't come back." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the growing tension in the room. Ed finally broke the silence. "I'll call the sheriff. He'll know what to do." But as Ed reached for the phone, a loud bang echoed through the room. The door flew open, and a blast of cold wind rushed in, accompanied by a flurry of snow. Standing in the doorway, looking equally panicked, was Sheriff Dan Holloway. "Sheriff," Marge gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "What on earth are you doing out in this storm?" "I could ask you the same," Dan replied, his voice sharp but strained. He took in the scene: Mary, the stranger by the fire, and the Millers. Before turning to Mary, "I came looking for you. Got a call from the gas station attendant. Said your grandchildren left you there, and drove off." Mary's stomach churned at the mention of her grandchildren. The betrayal still stung deeply, but she pushed the pain aside. "Sheriff, you have to listen. There's something in the woods, something at the old Carson cabin. It's evil. I barely made it out alive. And this man," she pointed to the stranger, "he's the last survivor of the Carson family." The sheriff's face darkened as he glanced at the man, who was still slumped in the chair, shivering uncontrollably. "Last survivor? The Carsons disappeared 50 years ago." "I know, but he's been out there. He told me it's been waiting for someone to claim. And now that I've been there, I think it's awake." Dan shook his head slowly, clearly struggling to process the information. "Mary, I don't know what you think you saw." "You don't believe me." Mary's voice rose in frustration. "I know what I saw. There's something wrong with that place. People have been disappearing there for years." The sheriff ran a hand through his graying hair, sighing heavily. "Look, I'll send a few of my men out there to check it out in the morning once the storm clears. But for now, the best thing you can do is rest." But Mary couldn't rest. The fire in her chest, the urgency in her voice, wouldn't allow her to sit still while more lives were at risk. "No, we can't wait. If we don't do something now, more people will die." Ed, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Dan, if Mary says there's something out there, we have to take it seriously. The Carsons, we never did get a straight answer about what happened to them." The sheriff hesitated, then finally nodded. "Fine. I'll gather some of the boys. We'll head out there tonight, storm or no storm." Mary felt a wave of relief, though it was tempered by the fear that still clung to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. Over the next hour, a small group of men from the town gathered at the Miller's house. Armed with flashlights, rifles, and the town's collective courage, they prepared to make the trek through the storm to the Carson cabin. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire town knew what was happening. People whispered about curses and ghosts, about long-forgotten legends that had haunted Hillcrest for decades. As Mary prepared to join the search party, Marge stopped her. "You've been through enough, Mary. Let the men handle this." But Mary shook her head firmly. "I need to see this through. I can't let anyone else face what I did without knowing what's out there." The sheriff handed her a flashlight, his face grim. "Stay close, Mary. This isn't going to be easy." The group trudged through the storm, the wind howling in their ears, snow blinding them with every step. But they pressed on, determined to uncover the truth about the cabin and whatever darkness lingered there. Mary walked at the front of the group, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the woods. The cabin loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, just as Mary remembered. But something was different now. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that sent shivers down her spine. The sheriff raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. "Stay alert," he whispered. "We don't know what we're dealing with." As they approached the cabin, the wind seemed to die down, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. The men fanned out, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their beams flickering over the decaying wood and shattered windows. Then, out of the silence, came a sound. A low, guttural growl, followed by a series of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The men froze, their eyes wide with fear, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mary's heart raced. It was happening again. Before anyone could react, the door to the cabin swung open with the door to the cabin creaked open, as if pulled by invisible hands, sending a collective shiver through the group. The men stood frozen, their flashlights trembling in their grips, the beams of light barely penetrating the thick, ominous darkness that spilled out from within the cabin like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, swirling in the air around them, a disembodied chorus of voices filled with malice and despair. Mary felt the weight of it pressing down on her, the cold from the storm outside suddenly paling in comparison to the chill that emanated from the open door. Her breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the flashlight tighter, forcing herself to take a step forward. "Stay back, Mary," Sheriff Holloway barked, his voice tense with fear. But Mary couldn't retreat. Not now, not after everything she had endured. This was the moment she had been running toward since the blizzard first trapped her in this nightmare. There was no turning back. "I have to know," Mary whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Her voice was barely audible, but it steadied her resolve. She took another step toward the door, the beam of her flashlight wavering as the wind suddenly stilled around them. It was as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Behind her, the men hesitated, unsure whether to follow or flee. They had grown up hearing the legends of the Carson family and the cursed cabin. Stories whispered over campfires and in hushed conversations, but none of them had ever expected to face the reality of those dark tales. Now, standing at the threshold of something far beyond their comprehension, they could feel the truth of those legends clawing at them, urging them to leave. Mary ignored their fear. She had seen enough to know that the cabin was not just a place. It was a presence, a force that had claimed lives and broken spirits. And now, standing so close to it, she could feel it calling to her, tugging at the edges of her mind. It was a dark and terrible hunger, and it wanted her. She stepped across the threshold, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the warped wooden floor. The inside of the cabin was exactly as she remembered: decaying furniture, dusty shelves, and the strange, old-fashioned relics of the family that had vanished here. But now, in the stillness, it felt alive, as though the walls themselves were watching her. Behind her, the sheriff and the others reluctantly followed, their flashlights sweeping through the room. The whispers were louder inside, though still impossible to understand, and the air was thick with something that felt almost tangible, a presence that lurked in the darkness, waiting. Mary made her way to the center of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The photograph of the Carson family still sat on the shelf where she had left it, the smiling faces of the family frozen in time. But now, as she stared at the photo, something had changed. The faces looked different. The father's expression seemed darker, the mother's eyes hollow, and the children's once innocent smiles twisted into grimaces of fear. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. It was then that she noticed something else, something she hadn't seen before. At the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows, was a door. It was barely visible, worn and weathered like the rest of the cabin. But now it seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly light. "What's behind that door?" Mary asked aloud, her voice trembling. The sheriff stepped forward, his face pale. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." Together, they approached the door, every step filled with mounting dread. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the cabin itself was trying to warn them away. But Mary knew they couldn't stop now. The answers they sought were behind that door, answers to the mystery of the Carson family, the strange occurrences in the woods, and the curse that had plagued this place for decades. Sheriff Holloway reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. He hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Mary. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary nodded. "We have to know." With a deep breath, the sheriff turned the handle and pushed the door open. A blast of cold air rushed out, even colder than the blizzard outside, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices, angry, desperate, pleading. The light from their flashlights flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. What lay beyond the door was a small windowless room. At first glance, it looked like a simple storage area, filled with dusty crates and old furniture. But there, in the center of the room, was something that made Mary's blood run cold. It was an altar. The crude stone structure was covered in strange symbols, ancient, dark markings that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. On the altar sat a large, weathered book, its pages yellowed with age and covered in the same strange symbols. Surrounding the altar were remnants of candles, melted down to almost nothing, and what looked like pieces of old, tattered clothing. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, and the sense of malevolence was overwhelming. This isn't right," one of the men whispered, backing away. Mary stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the book. She could feel the power emanating from it, a dark and twisted energy that filled the room. It was clear now. This was the source of the curse. The Carson family hadn't just disappeared. They had been consumed by whatever dark ritual had been performed here. Her hand shook as she reached for the book. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if warning her not to touch it. But she ignored them. She needed to know the truth. With trembling fingers, she opened the book. The pages were filled with strange, incomprehensible symbols, drawings of twisted figures, and dark rituals. As she flipped through the pages, a terrible realization dawned on her. The Carson family hadn't been victims of some supernatural force. They had summoned it. In their desperation, they had performed a ritual, a dark pact, to protect themselves from the storm. But something had gone horribly wrong. Instead of protecting them, the ritual had cursed the land, binding the family, and anyone who entered the cabin, to a fate worse than death. Mary's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of it all settled over her. The curse had been dormant for years, waiting for someone to awaken it. And now she had unwittingly done just that. "We have to destroy this," Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "The book, the altar, everything." The sheriff nodded, his face grim. "How?" Before Mary could answer, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker. Then, from the shadows, something began to stir. A figure emerged, dark, indistinct, but unmistakably human. It was tall and gaunt, its movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. As it stepped into the flickering light, Mary's blood ran cold. It was the father from the photograph, the patriarch of the Carson family, but twisted, his face contorted with anguish and rage. He reached out a bony hand, his eyes hollow and lifeless, and in a voice that was both familiar and horrifying. He spoke, "You cannot leave." Panic gripped the group as the figure advanced. One of the men raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the figure let out a terrible guttural scream, a sound that shook the very walls of the cabin. The room seemed to warp and shift, the shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. "Run!" Sheriff Holloway shouted. The group scrambled toward the door, their flashlights flickering wildly as they ran. Mary was the last to leave, her eyes still locked on the figure of the Carson patriarch. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul, as if pleading for something, release, forgiveness, or perhaps revenge. But Mary couldn't stop. She turned and fled, her heart pounding as she followed the others out of the cabin and into the snowstorm. The group didn't stop running until they were well outside the woods, the cabin a distant, dark shape in the blinding snow. They collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from fear and exhaustion. Mary looked back at the cabin, its dark silhouette barely visible through the storm. The whispers had stopped, and the air was eerily still, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The sheriff, panting heavily, turned to Mary. "What now?" Mary's gaze hardened. We burn it. The cabin, the book, everything. We end this. By morning, the storm had passed, and the townspeople gathered at the edge of the woods. With torches and gasoline, they set the cabin ablaze, watching as the flames consumed the dark history that had haunted Hillcrest for so long. The fire roared, and with it, the curse was finally lifted. As the flames died down, Mary stood in silence, watching the last remnants of the cabin turn to ash. The weight that had pressed on her heart for so long began to lift, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. The townspeople murmured among themselves, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but grateful that the nightmare was over. Mary, however, knew that the real battle had been fought long before this night, the battle for her soul, her dignity, and